Hello, welcome back. This is Lecture 7. It is a lament that India did not have a strong tradition of written histories, and only Chinese accounts of pilgrims were available for eyewitness descriptions of life and society. Writing and literacy came late to India, our earliest examples being found on the pillars erected by King Ashoka in the 4th century before the Common Era. Without written documents, the early days of Buddhism are often described as prehistory. The Atlas of Maritime Buddhism seeks to provide one method of uncovering what was happening over these centuries when the written record is silent. In seeking for these data, the research turns away from the approach of event-structured history. Rather, the focus shifts to an attempt of documenting networks and systems of interchange. The physical artifacts that help signal the presence of unrecorded activity are tombs, religious structures, trade goods, roadways, docks, shipwrecks, kill sites, debris from mining, settlement remains, cave shelters, silting patterns, shifting river channels, metal objects, art, tools, precious stone, jewelry, bricks, anaerobic preserved wood, stone bridges, any human altered object. The discovery of and the interpretation of these signifiers from the past are most often in the hands of archaeologists. But a host of other disciplines are increasingly involved in the dating and the purpose of such artifacts. Physicists have provided ways of determining the time of the firing for bricks, so that the brick structures can now have temporal data as well as location. Chemists can tie ceramic shards to specific kilns and clay deposits thousands of miles from where the piece may have been uncovered. Metallurgy has methods for analyzing metal objects into their component elements and even determine the source of the ore that was used to produce the mix. Without a written document, we can know the date of construction and map the sources for the components anywhere in the world. This is more accurate information than any author was able to pen in written historical documents hundreds of years ago. Cargoes from ships that have rested for centuries on the floor of the sea help us to recreate the purpose and the itinerary of an ancient voyage. Wooden statues buried in mud along the canals of the Mekong Delta in Vietnam can be dated with a high degree of certainty as to the age of the local trees that provided the material for carvers 1,500 years ago. Stone docks that once provided landing for ocean-going ships are being uncovered far inland, indicating the silting that plagues harbors and sometimes renders them useless. Roadways, bridges constructed of stone may be used to map the travel routes of the past. Ancient and sometimes abandoned caravan routes marked by nodes of ruined cities can be plotted in Inner Asia. While we may not have a written record of events, These data from multiple disciplines provide evidence for the activities and the movements of people and objects over time. Using tags and markup to link such information across hundreds of miles, we can begin mapping our information and seeing if patterns emerge pointing to the systems that brought people and objects to certain points of longitude and latitude. These traces, the remainders of the past, in many cases still resonate with the present. Human activity of today often occurs in patterns that are consistent with the ancient ones. Travel routes from Europe to Asia, especially the sea lanes, have not shifted significantly. Thus, we can use current knowledge about the journey to compare with descriptions and available information from the ancient past. It is important that our attempt to uncover history avoid seeing all these traces as isolated entities. Fortunately, there are some written records that can be used to study all of our material data. Our framing should be broad enough to encompass concepts of a flow of people and systemic activities accompanied by products and culture. Roman records can be of help in our study of trade across the southern shores of Eurasia. Well, during the time of the infamous Roman Emperor Nero, that was 27 from Common Era up to 14 of the 27 before the Common Era up to 14 of the Common Era, a sailing manual was produced. The Periplus of the Erythraean Sea, providing a mariner's view of ocean travel across the Western Indian Ocean, that is, the Erythraean Sea. The cargo for the ships can also be documented. Emperor Domitian, who was 81 to 76 of the Common Era, constructed a huge storage facility for black pepper and spices from South India. When the Huns invaded Rome in the 4th century, they were given tribute in exchange for withdrawal. A sizable part of the payment was made up of 3,000 pounds of black pepper from South India. It was available because Rome had built warehouses to hold huge quantities of such spices. Rome was a consumer economy. It did not have much in the way of manufactured goods to exchange with those who carried them from the eastern parts of the continent. They did have gold and silver coins. And these were used to pay for the items being imported. The metals were secured from the conquest of Egypt, as well as the Spanish and Illyrian wars. Some have estimated that Rome took home the equivalent of 1 billion denarii coins. Clearly, the money situation in the kingdom was famed for its amount and liquidity. They had the gold and silver needed to buy large amounts of goods from abroad. In one sense, this was not using coins as currency so much as an export of these metals from Rome in a recognized form that guaranteed the weight and thus the value of each piece. That is why the debasement of coinage was detrimental to the exchange. When Emperor Vespasian, 69 to 73 of the Common Era, used less gold in his coins, it was immediately noted in the trading circles and slowed the trade arriving in Rome. Thus, the face value of coins was of less significance compared to the amount of gold contained in them. In this way, gold becomes an important part of our study. While the metal itself cannot be dated, coins with images of ruling emperors are a precise way of dealing with temporality. It is the Roman gold coin that provides a surprise for our study. The written documents of the leaders in the Mediterranean kingdom indicate that the export of gold to Asia to buy silk was so great that the treasury of this wealthiest state in the Mediterranean was being depleted. Thus, the presence and absence of Roman gold coins provides a guide for identifying the major trade routes that linked India to Rome. Now, it is striking that only a handful of Roman gold coins have been found in Chinese archaeological excavations. Even those that exist are in many cases local inner Asian forgeries. They often appear in tombs where they were used to weight down the eyelids of corpses. These coins do not appear to have been used for commerce, but were limited to a ritual use. While Roman histories cry out against the fact that their sizable treasury is being emptied to send gold coins to Asia for luxury goods, China is not the location for those many gold coins. Rather, the archaeological process has shown that South India is the main holder of payment from Rome. This alerts us to the fact that caravans across Eurasia were a smaller component than the maritime trade between the two ends of the continent. It was through the ports of the west coast of India that trade flowed across the Indian Ocean and eventually floated down the Nile to Alexandria. Thousands of Roman gold and silver coins have been discovered in South India, and the number increases every year with new archaeological excavations. Now, this is one example of bringing together documentation with known archaeological discoveries. In this case, the destination of Roman precious metal can be documented not to China, but to India. Rome was very aware of the existence of India. Strabo included it within the Roman Oecumene, that is, the known parts of the world. He said that one could sail to India within a matter of days if the wind was strong enough. The Roman world was known from Spain to India, according to Strabo. The monsoon trade across the Indian Ocean had its first ports of entry along the west coast of India. It was here that the main direct contacts of India with Africa, Arabia, and the Mediterranean regions existed. The size of the trade in the Red Sea was sufficient to attract pirates, and this meant that protection was needed. Military outposts lined the route from Berenike to Koptos to fight off robbers from the valuable items being carried to and from the Red Sea ports tied to Indian commerce. Even aboard ships at sea, there was need for a fleet of naval vessels to protect the merchandise until the vessels were well out to sea. Emperor Trajan provided much of this protection because the trade with India was a major part of the economy of the kingdom. Ships loaded with tons of black pepper or other spices represented huge outlays of gold and silver. One report says 3 ships that were carrying spice had cargoes worth 27 pounds of gold. Now, this type of trade could only be done by groups or individuals who possessed large amounts of wealth. The ports on the west coast of India helped to fuel the extension of the trading networks from the Indian Ocean. Goods in these entrepôts were coming and going to China. One way to make that journey was from the coastline of India through Inner Asia to China. Another way was developed into the extensive networks across the Bay of Bengal to South, East, and finally East Asia. The Inner Asia caravan routes had to go around the Himalayan western expanse, crossing over the Pamirs and Tian Shan ranges, before turning east through the Tarim Basin and the Taklamakan. This route covered 600 miles of desert, where Buddhist travelers reported they could find the way by following the bones of dead animals that had perished in the crossing. Such was one link from the Mediterranean through the sea lanes of Western Indian Ocean before resorting to land routes through Inner Asia. It is a route that has often been overlooked by those who study the so-called Silk Road, seeing it only as a single land route across Persia to the west. The name Silk Road, coined in the 19th century by Baron von Richthofen, was not at first a description of routes stretching across the continent from China to the Mediterranean. He describes it as starting at Balkh, south of the Oxus River, and extending to Xi'an. It was this route that shipments from and to the western shores of India were transported to China. Now, Richthofen was a geographer, and his main interest was to provide a map for the German government to lay a railroad that would connect China and Europe. Therefore, his first attempt was to make a map from China up to Balkh. Since his object was to have a route all the way to Europe, he expanded his survey to cover the distance from Balkh to the western part of Eurasia. In this way, Silk Road came to be seen as a route across all of the continent. So his work is not so much a description of ancient caravan routes as it was plotting for a modern rail system. His vision was a railroad stretching from the seaport of Jiaozhou at Qingdao across Eurasia using the modern industrial energy of coal-driven steam engines. In one way, the sea was a competitor to Trans-Asian rail system being proposed by Richthofen. And he does not give much attention to the maritime. When the idea of the modern rail route was abandoned by his government, he seems to have lost all interest in the Silk Road and never mentioned it again in his writings. It is in the present that the One Road, One Belt project of China has brought a new reality to the vision that Richthofen had more than a century ago. The high-speed rail from China to Europe is, with little fanfare, being established. Our current literature often describes the complex systems of trade with the metaphor of a road, just as Richthofen had done. As a result, we now have suggestions of silk, ceramics, cotton, spice, glass, gems, and even tea roads. So if we consider the major items flowing between Asia and Europe, the list of roads could be expanded to include sandalwood, cinnamon, black pepper, gold, silver, copper, cloves, nutmeg, pearl, tortoiseshell, ivory, diamonds, sapphires, camphor, frankincense, incense. Each is a valid approach to the archaeological and textual records. However, they are merely accounts of how varied items of trade had a presence in the larger complex in which humans exchange goods. It is also possible to look at the complex array of trails, river crossings, inscription locations, monastic remains that mark the multiple pathways of travelers across the hinterland roads. Many of these unknown roads that are still discernible indicate that merchants followed a variety of them over time. While we might name a band of roadways by the products that were carried along them, it may be more accurate to say the road of silk traders, etc., since it was not only the product, but also the people who transported it. The Atlas of Maritime Buddhism is based on the premise that whatever the product in pre-modern times, merchandise had to move either by land or water. Caravans of animals made their way over land-based transit zones, and ships moved by a series of sailing circuits in the sea or followed embankments of rivers. Thus, we could speak of the sea route as a major road, just as caravan routes were a type of major road. Now, the combination of sea and land routes can be found throughout the systems of trade. The transfer of goods at the west coast of India for transport across Inner Asia land bridge to China belongs to this category. One of the other great crossings was the Isthmus of Kra, where the Malaysian peninsula narrows to a significant degree, and it was faster and perhaps safer to unload and carry goods across it than to sail around the peninsula. The subcontinent of India was in one sense a large landmass blocking passage from the Indian Ocean to the eastern shores of Eurasia. It does narrow significantly at the south, and traders had a choice either to circumnavigate it and Sri Lanka across the southern tip of India by land from western seaports to eastern ones using bullock carts to haul merchandise. While the land portions of these dual sea hinterland crossings might be extensive, there were economic factors that tended towards sea and river flotation whenever possible. The land travel created a situation where the length of the journey passed beyond the point of reasonable profit. That is why it is important to relook at the passage across Persia to the Mediterranean, and to understand the mechanism by which such long distances could be used by commercially viable enterprise. Baron Richthofen accounted for the drop of commerce to Europe across Persia from China in the 13th century by the idea that silk production had been introduced to the West and Chinese silk was no longer a monopoly. Well, had he given more thought to the sea, he would have noted that the volume of trade between Europe and East Asia was still flowing, but on ships from Egypt, Arabia, and Western European maritime empires that bypassed the caravan routes. The volume of textiles alone could not account for the shifts in trading patterns. These are suggestions for how history can include more than written documents. A ceramic shard found in Persia that can be identified as something produced in a specific kill site in eastern China becomes a kind of document. It is an object that carries with it specific information that allows us to catch glimpses of a world of long-distance interactions. The Chinese shard in Persia, Iraq, may be low-fire, ordinary dinnerware, indicating it was never an item of great economic value. It was, as mentioned before, a part of low-value, high-volume commerce. The thousands of bits of such ceramic found in modern-day Iraq are proof of the sizable volume that was moved from China to Western Asia. Even such mundane information can be an important part of the data that helps us to provide context for the flow of Buddhism, as it, like the shard, moved over time from place to place. Thank you very much. See you next time for Lecture 8.